Crimes are often committed in a fit of emotion, and their motives are usually quite mundane. As a rule, investigating such crimes does not pose a major challenge. But what should be done if the criminal acts with a cold mind? If they are among the smartest people on the planet? What traps need to be set to outsmart such an opponent? On October 26, 1988, a woman named Peggy Carr, a 41-year-old waitress, suddenly felt excruciating pain in her chest. She had never experienced anything like it before. The first thing that came to her mind was that she was having a heart attack. However, she soon realized that was unlikely. Peggy left work early. Her daughter, who also worked at the same cafe as Peggy, helped her get home. By the time Peggy was home, the pain had become unbearable. She felt as if her body was on fire. My arms went numb, and my legs felt like thousands of needles were pricking them at once, she described her sensations. Peggy had worked at the cafe for a long time, and sometimes, after a hard day's work, she felt pain in her legs. But what she was feeling now was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Peggy's husband, Pike, was hunting that day. He didn't come home until evening. Pike tried to persuade his wife to wait until morning, but both she and the children begged him not to wait for a new day. Eventually, Pike gave in and took Peggy to the nearest hospital. The doctors in the emergency department were baffled. They had never seen anything like it before. The test results were normal. The doctors had only one assumption: the pain was psychosomatic. In other words, the pain was the result of some emotional distress or stress. Peggy was outraged by this explanation. She was in more pain than ever before. "I know this isn't in my head. It's real," she said. But the doctors couldn't offer any specific help. They only kept her under observation in the hospital. Surprisingly, a few days of rest actually solved the problem. The pain went away, and Peggy returned home. The paradox was that she hadn't received any medical treatment in the hospital, so it was completely unclear what had ultimately helped alleviate the pain. It seemed the doctors were right, and the cause of the pain was only in Peggy's head, in the distress she was experiencing. This would have been quite logical if not for one but. After spending just a couple of days at home, Peggy was struck by terrible pain again, this time even worse than before. And on November 1st, 1988, the woman was back in the hospital, but this time she wasn't alone. At this point, it's worth telling more about Peggy and her husband, Pike. At the time of the events described, they had been married for 6 months. For both of them, this was their second marriage. Little is known about Peggy's first husband, except that she had 3 children with him. Pike also had children from a previous marriage, a boy and a girl. Pike and Peggy had known each other for a long time. It was like something we often see in movies. People who have known each other for years, but only realize they are ready to be together later in life. Now we return to November 1st, 1988, the day Peggy was hospitalized for the second time. As already mentioned, this time Peggy was not alone. Her son Dwayne and Pike's son Travis were also hospitalized with her. At first, they only felt slight tingling in their legs, but with each passing minute, the tingling grew stronger. Peggy was in so much pain that she wanted to scream, but she couldn't. In fact, she could no longer speak properly, as if she had gone numb. Eventually, she completely lost the ability to speak. Sign language became her only means of communication. As before, the doctors were completely baffled, until one of them, neurologist Dr. Hassler, noticed the hair on Peggy's pillow. The hair loss led him to suspect poisoning. The only poison he believed could cause such symptoms was thallium. After testing Peggy's blood for thallium, the doctor was shocked. The thallium level in Peggy's blood was thousands of times higher than normal. Before 1970, thallium was used as a component in rat poison, but it was later banned. Thallium poisoning causes slow atrophy of nerve cells, which can lead to paralysis or even death. This poison has two very unpleasant characteristics. First, it acts relatively slowly on the body. Symptoms of thallium poisoning can appear with a significant delay, making it almost impossible to determine the exact date and time the poison was ingested. Second, and more importantly, there is no antidote or cure for thallium poisoning. One can only hope that the body will overcome it on its own. Fortunately, the young men, Travis and Dwayne, received a dose of poison that their bodies were able to overcome. They experienced terrible pain, but were eventually discharged from the hospital. Peggy's case was different. She almost completely lost her hair, lost the ability to speak, open her eyes, and even move. Ultimately, she fell into a coma. As previously mentioned, there is no antidote for thallium, so the doctors were unable to help her. Over time, it became clear that she would not be able to overcome the illness. On March 3, 1989, after 4 months in a coma, Peggy was taken off life support. This was done in the presence of her husband and children, who would never forget that day, the last day of their mother's life. As soon as the doctors learned about the thallium poisoning, they immediately passed this information on to the police. Most likely, the poison entered the woman's body through food. Such poisonings fell under the jurisdiction of the FBI, so from the first days, the police and the FBI worked together. The most terrifying thing was that it was completely unclear what had caused the poisoning. This raised concerns that the poisonings could become widespread. First, water samples were taken from the town where Peggy Carr lived. Fortunately, no poison was found there. More than 400 different items were taken from the Carr family home for analysis. Every product from their refrigerator, as well as items already in the trash, bottles, butter wrappers, and other food packaging. The investigation took more than 2 weeks, and ultimately, the source of the poison was found. It was a Coca-Cola bottle. 3 open Coca-Cola bottles found in the Carr home were sent to the lab for testing. It was discovered that each bottle contained a lethal dose of thallium. At this moment, the detectives working on the case were truly frightened. What if this was the beginning of something much bigger? What if some madman was pouring thallium into Coca-Cola bottles? Or, even worse, what if there was a disgruntled employee at the Coca-Cola plant secretly adding poison to the bottles? The factory was immediately notified. An inspection conducted there showed that everything was in order at the plant. Additionally, the fact that no other poisoning cases were found in the area suggested that this was a localized incident specifically targeting the Carr household. But who could be responsible for this? And how did the criminal manage to put poison in sealed bottles? Although Pike and Peggy had only been married for 6 months, their marriage was ideal only on the surface. Pike frequently stayed late at work. At some point, this happened so often that Peggy began to think it was just an excuse. One evening, 5 weeks before the poisoning, Peggy went to Pike's workplace. There were only 2 cars in the parking lot. One belonged to her husband, and the other to his ex-girlfriend. Peggy was incredibly upset by what she saw. That same evening, she and the children moved to a hotel, leaving Pike a letter. "Dear Pike, I want to give you some time to think about us. I can't go on living like this. I can't imagine life without you, but I'm also not ready to live with you knowing you don't want to. I love you, Peggy." Peggy lived in the hotel for about a week. Then the couple resolved their differences, and Peggy returned home with the children. As mentioned earlier, on the day Peggy first felt the pain, Her husband was not at home. He returned only in the evening and was not particularly eager to take Peggy to the hospital. In principle, everything seemed clear. It appeared that the main suspect had been identified. However, everything changed when the test results of other family members came in. They showed that every resident of the house had some level of thallium in their blood. For some, like Peggy, the dose was lethal. For others, it was simply many times higher than normal, including Pike and even his children. It was unlikely that a man who wanted to kill his wife would also poison himself. Apparently, no one in the house knew that the bottles contained thallium. Moreover, none of the residents could say how these bottles had ended up in the house. As it turned out, no one had bought the Coca-Cola. Additionally, 2 weeks before the poisoning, someone had slipped a threatening letter into the Carr's mailbox. "You and your so-called family have 2 weeks to leave Florida or you will die. This is not a joke." At the time, no one in the Carr household paid any attention to these threats. The analysis of the sealed bottles also showed that their caps had micro damage. Thus, someone had bought a pack of Coca-Cola bottles, removed the caps, put thallium in the bottles, and then put new caps back on. This was likely intended to make it appear as if the bottles had never been opened. Then, the criminal broke into the Carr family home and left the bottles there. The detective began questioning people who knew the Carr family. No one had the slightest idea how these people could have harmed anyone. The Carr family lived in a secluded area. They had friends who came and went regularly, and only 2 neighbors, George Trepal and his wife Diana. During the conversation with George, the detective realized that he had no sympathy for the Carr family. Moreover, when the detective asked Trepal why someone would want to poison the Carr family, he replied, "Probably someone wanted them to move away." The phrase was strikingly similar to the one in the threatening letter. This seemed incredibly strange to the detective, as George Trepal and his wife Diana were the only ones living near the Carr family. If someone wanted them to leave, who else but the Trepals could it be? The detective began studying George Trepal's background. George was a programmer and, like his wife, a member of Mensa International, an organization that includes only 2% of the smartest people on Earth. In the past, George had spent 3 years in prison for manufacturing methamphetamine. At that time, he had worked for one of the largest illegal laboratories in the southern United States. This was very important because the method George used to produce methamphetamine required thallium as a catalyst. Of course, thallium is not something you can just go out and buy. Therefore, the person who wanted to poison the Carr family had to have sufficient knowledge of chemistry to produce thallium independently. George Trepal and his wife Diana, who was a chemist by education, had this knowledge. But what was the motive behind this crime? The detective found out that the neighbors really did not get along. The Trepals were educated people and had no children. Essentially, they considered the Carrs to be common riffraff. George and his wife Diana preferred quiet, while the Carr children were constant sources of noise. In particular, the Carr sons often played music loudly. George asked them not to, but they didn't care. Peggy and Pike were either unable or unwilling to quiet the teenagers. This often led to arguments between Diana Trepal and Peggy Carr. George Trepal had a long list of grievances against the Carrs. He hated how people constantly came to their house, how they often played the radio loudly, and how their children rode ATVs. From the moment the Carrs moved in, they had disrupted the peace and quiet of George and Diana Trepal. With the information described above, the detective felt an inner certainty that the Trepals were involved in the poisoning of Peggy Carr. But could he prove it? No. At this stage, he couldn't even get a search warrant. At this point, a woman named Susan Garak enters the case. 5 weeks after Peggy Carr's death, Susan Garak attended an event called Mystical Crimes. George and Diana Trepal were also there. The event participants played a role-playing game where they acted out roles in various crimes. The goal of the game was to solve these crimes. Susan Garak was not there to play games. She was an undercover police officer. Her goal was to befriend George Trepal, to get close enough to him to extract any information about the poisoning of Peggy Carr. Of course, she did not use her real name. The FBI had created a role for her designed to attract Trepal. Thus, Agent Susan Garak became a woman named Shirley Gwynn. According to her legend, she had no children but had an abusive husband. This was meant to evoke George's sympathy, perhaps so deeply that he would eventually suggest to his new friend that she poison her husband. The Trepal family wrote the script for one of the murders acted out at the event. Here is a small excerpt from that script. When the threat of death appears at the doorstep, calculating people throw away their food and carefully check what they drink. It's unlikely that anyone dies from magic. Most items at the doorstep are simply a neighbor's way of saying, "I don't like you." It was hard not to see the analogy with the murder of Peggy Carr in this text. At this event, Susan Garak, under the name Shirley Gwynn, met Diana and George Trepal. As expected, she gained George's sympathy, and soon Shirley and George began spending a lot of time together. However, Susan did not try to befriend Diana. She expected Diana to be defensive, to treat her as a homewrecker. Curiously, Diana never got angry about the time George now spent with another woman. Whenever Diana interacted with Susan, she was friendly and polite. There was no expected jealousy. Susan was genuinely puzzled by Diana's behavior. Susan often called the Trepal household. When Diana answered the phone, she would quickly pass it to George. On one hand, the fact that George's wife did not put up barriers for Susan made the operation easier. On the other hand, Diana's passivity was at least alarming. As planned, Shirley gradually told George about her family problems, and the fictional husband Richard was designed in such a way that George would hate him. Although Susan succeeded in making George hate Richard, she failed to convince him to suggest poison as a solution to the problem. However, George proposed another method, specifically to frame Richard as a pedophile. George even developed a fairly detailed plan for how Susan could do this, but this was not what she had expected. George also told Susan how he and his wife sometimes played pranks on people they gave rides to. George would put mild drugs in cookies and offer them to his passengers. He and his wife found this amusing. Meanwhile, the operation dragged on. Instead of the expected few weeks, Susan Garak had been living as Shirley Gwynn for 8 months. Gradually, this began to frighten her. George was always polite to her, had a good sense of humor, and could talk for hours on almost any topic. Susan began to feel that she was developing sympathy for him. The FBI, for its part, had begun to consider the operation futile. It wasn't advancing the case at all. More than a year had passed since the poisoning, and the case was at a standstill. But it was at this moment that George made a fatal mistake. At one point, George told Susan that he and his wife were leaving and selling the house. This was the chance Susan had been waiting for. Somehow, she managed to convince George not to sell the house, but to rent it to her instead. He agreed, and only now could the police, who did not have a search warrant, enter the house. In the Trepal's house, detectives discovered a secret room. It was completely soundproof. When the door was closed, it was impossible to hear anything happening inside, including human screams. The room contained something resembling a wooden bed with restraints for the hands and feet. It looked more like a torture chamber. Clearly, No one builds such rooms without a purpose. The room had been thoroughly cleaned. There was no blood or semen. If it was a torture chamber, fortunately, it seemed no one had used it yet. When Susan entered, a chill ran down her spine. She had a strong feeling that this room was intended for her character, Shirley Gwynn. According to the legend, Shirley had no job or children and no longer lived with her husband. If Shirley had been real, George could have easily made her disappear. And most importantly, in the Trapal's garage, a bottle containing traces of thallium was found. Finally, the detectives had something linking the Trapals to the crime. 13 months after Peggy Carr's death, George Trepal was arrested on April 7, 1990. He was charged with the murder of Peggy Carr and 6 attempted murders of other Carr family members. During the trial, Susan Garak was the key witness for the prosecution. The day after she testified, Diana approached her and said, "I hope you know you're a big fool." Apart from George, the only person who could have had the necessary knowledge to produce the poison was his wife, Diana. George's lawyer wanted to use this as a line of defense, but George Trepal himself forbade him from even hinting that Diana could be the possible perpetrator of the poisoning. In the end, George Trepal was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. For her work on this case, Susan Garak was appointed deputy sheriff of the state of Florida in 1995. She wrote a book about this story titled Toxic Mind. The story of Peggy Carr and her family is an example of how a crime can be meticulously planned and executed by someone with a high intellect and knowledge of chemistry. George Trepal, using his skills and access to dangerous substances, was able to orchestrate a murder that initially seemed like an unsolvable mystery.